a dirty cop. He's been accused of by many people of engaging in a variety of behaviors as a police officer that led to the conviction of a number of men, not only black men, but mostly black men in the 80s and 90s. And these men, many of them, they had identified how he had engaged in their particular crimes and their particular cases in ways that were unethical. So I think that's the big question. Like the line that we're always playing with in this story is what's illegal versus what might be unethical. And as a police officer, I think he holds the notion and the idea, even to this day, that New York City was the crime capital of the country in the 1980s. There were more murders taking place in New York City than per capita than any other place in this country. People wanted the streets cleaned up. They wanted the drugs off the street. Juries wanted the folks convicted. Judges, everybody wanted this. And he perceives himself as being a victim of that now. He went out and did his job, and now everybody wants to point blame at him. The wrongfully convicted say they were easy targets because they were young black men. And maybe they had a criminal record of some sort, but they did not actually commit these crimes. And there was actually no evidence in their various cases that directly tied them to the crimes for which they were ultimately convicted. These are the stakes that we're trying to navigate as we tell this story of how did this happen? Why did this happen? And how does it implicate all of us who are listening to this podcast who think, oh, this guy, Scarcella, is bad? Well, let's be clear. A detective can only arrest someone. They cannot formally indict anyone. They cannot try anyone, and they cannot convict anyone. That involves other players in the justice system.
It can't just be the detective. It's got to be the detective, the district attorney, or in a federal case, it would be the U.S. attorney. Mm-hmm. You're going to need judges to be involved. You're going to need, public defenders or defense attorneys to kind of, placate what the detective is saying, or not look into it, or just kind of go along with whatever they say is gospel.
Yeah.
So many people have to be involved for something like this to go bad.
Many things. And it has to happen repeatedly, and it has to happen systematically. The era in which Louis Scarcella was in his heyday precedes DNA. It precedes the whole regime, which is like a seismic change when we were able to finally start to use DNA as a way to identify folks in the criminal or whoever was involved in a particular crime. Prior to that, short of having fingerprints or a smoking gun, there was quite a bit of speculation that was part of the process. So, for instance, in the vast majority of the cases in which Louis Scarcella was involved or that went to trial, particularly the ones we cover in our story, they were one witness murders. No physical evidence, no weapon, no cameras. So what you were going on, and this is why someone like Scarcella is implicated, and the detective of that era is implicated, is because their word was gospel.
Right.
When he walks into that courtroom, and he's a good-looking guy, he's very credible, he wears a nice suit, he's very affable. When he gets on that witness stand and says what he believes happened, a jury, some of whom are frightened, New Yorkers, people who want to see the city cleaned up, who are looking across and seeing a young black man who for them, is garden variety, run of the mill, drug dealer X. There's a weightedness towards believing that person without any evidence to the contrary. And that's largely what happened in many of these cases. And I think it demonstrates sort of the rudimentary, structure of our justice system, such that you didn't need much, quite frankly.
Did you ever read the book The Innocent Man by John Grisham?
Read a bunch of his books, and I know that one. Yeah. I can't even remember going through it. Yeah,
it's the only one that it's his only nonfiction book, and it's about a guy he's got some mental problems. He's not all there, and you can't hold down a job. Gets Social Security check, like just he's kind of running the streets, and he's been in trouble a few times. This always killed me when I read the book. So this woman who he's slept with before, and she's also a drug addict, like him. And so one day, he's slept with her a few times, and one day she's found somebody's gone to her house. She let him in, and she was raped and murdered. And so when they immediately zero in on him because he's been in trouble before and he knows her. They come, they question him for hours and hours and hours, and I don't think he ever admits it. But they put him on trial. He gets found guilty. The homicide detective and of course the district attorney in that case consistently say he stalked her. She let him into the house because she's slept with him before. He's kind of like a boyfriend. There was obviously a scuffle. He beats her, rapes her, and murders her. He acted alone. 100% acted alone. They find DNA. I'm sorry. They find semen. There is no DNA. They can blood match it. The blood is correct. It matches him. Goes to trial, loses, death penalty. Been on death row for whatever it was, 10 years, screaming the whole time, he's innocent, he's innocent, he's innocent. And finally, the Innocence Project comes in. They run the DNA because now DNA technology is available. They run the DNA. They find out it's absolutely not his DNA. Now they're going to put him back on trial. And now the government's position is, well, clearly he still raped and murdered her. He just had an accomplice. But the first trial, he acted alone. 100%, everybody that got it. Now you're going to retry him and have the same people get on the stand and say he had an accomplice. Now you're saying the evidence shows he had an accomplice. Like, just it was so. I just remember reading that book, going, bro, how do you sleep at night?
Yeah. Well,
like, how do you do that?
It's the mismatch of incentives. If you think about what incentivizes the government, prosecutor is winning. They're not incentivized by justice. Justice is not the incentive. And so that's part of the problem. A loss for them is a loss. And that loss could have political implications. If you are an elected official, which many prosecutors are and which many district attorneys are, if you're an elected official, a loss is a loss. And a loss has implications. And that's scary to think about when it comes to individual lives. But that's not how they're thinking about it. They're thinking about it in the aggregate. They're thinking about it in terms of how voters are going to perceive them, whether or not they are actually tough on crime, if that's what the objective is at that particular moment. And part of what our story explores is how in New York we see over the course of Scarcella's tenure, towards the end of his tenure, there is a real push by DA Hines, who was the long-term Brooklyn DA at that time. He ends up opening up his own wrongful conviction unit as a way to respond to the pressure that's now being put upon his office because of the emergence of wrongful convictions as a national phenomenon. So you see his own position shift from being tough on crime to, no, we are also about, transparency in wrongful convictions and ensuring that people are not going to be in jail for charges that they not convict. But the effort ultimately is to stay in office. The objective is to stay in power, right? And they can present it as if, they're trying to be proactive, but the actual reality and the inner workings of those departments even doesn't actually correlate with an objective of actually getting justice. Because even when those kinds of units have been set up at times, they're not actually yielding, exonerations. They're not actually yielding people getting out of prison. So it's a challenging thing for us to deal with. And I think it's the story in and of itself. And I don't want to give it all away. We just dropped episode 4 and there's a lot to be explored still. But it is still nevertheless, I think, just an important conversation for us to have, because it's inevitable. And I think it's happened in New York and it will happen other places, that when we do try to engage in justice reform, so in New York, in other places, we saw bail reform become a big deal 3 to 4 years ago. And now we're in a new moment where there's an immigration crisis, there's a rise in crime in some cities, not all cities across the country, but I live in Washington, D.C., there's a rise in crime. And so as a result of that, what does the public want? The public wants more police presence. They want more evidence to give them a sense of comfort that they're sleeping at night when they sleep at night. So we're constantly caught in this sort of this sort of topsy-turvy. Like we want on one hand in 2020 we wanted to defund the police, and everybody was like, we need to have police reform. But then 4 years later, that whole tune has been shifted back to we need more police, we need more accountability, we need more. And it kind of is, for me as a reporter, it's a chance to say, okay, let's use this story. This story is a way to put the mirror back on ourselves as a society. What is it we want? Because there are collateral consequences when we decide to empower the police. And the collateral consequences in this context were all these men who were in jail for crimes they didn't commit. And there was evidence the entire time that they were actually able to show that they didn't do it. In the case of Shabaka Shakur, he produced a witness that was able to say he was with them at the time of the murder. But because that person was a young black woman who themselves did not have credibility in the eyes of the jurors, there was disbelief. And it's a problem right now where, in this story at least, in the 80s and 90s, who do we believe and under what conditions?
Right. So how does this unravel? How do these guys end up meeting each other? So there's multiple jailhouse lawyers that are incarcerated that start to realize I have, and I'm assuming that all of them are saying like, I'm incarcerated for something I didn't do. Yeah. They're trying to kind of, make a life for themselves while they're incarcerated. What do I do? I do legal work. I'm smarter than the average bear in here. And so, this is a way for me to, one, I hustle, make a little bit of money, and two, have a purpose, which is hugely important in prison.
I mean, I think you've hit a nail. You've hit a lot of the points and a lot of the sort of the underlying rationale. They're the main two guys that we spend a lot of time with are Derek Hamilton, who many regard as like the greatest jailhouse lawyer of his generation. Not only because he was able to litigate his own way out of prison, but because he's been able to help other people. And as a matter of fact, he now is at Cardozo Law School. So here's a guy who
bank robber, right?
Derek Hamilton was he was a convicted murderer.
Okay,
and
sorry.
He was a convicted murderer, and he'd been convicted of 2 different murders. And our story has to end up dealing with not only the murder that involved Scarcella, but actually a previous murder that we call the bread truck murder that he was involved in and had been convicted for. So there's multiple layers to his story. But the point is now that the guy is actually at Cardozo Law School and leads a legal clinic for law students at least. So you talk about the tables turning and how life changes. It's fascinating how, you go from he was in solitary confinement for a number of years to now leading a legal clinic at a reputable law school in New York City. But all which is to say, he met another jailhouse attorney and lawyer, I should say, by the name of Shabaka Shakur. They met at Auburn Correctional. So the way it works is at different points in time, you could be shipped to different prisons across New York State. They were all in New York. They were at different points in time. These two in particular had met many, many years earlier, had known each other, had lost contact as they might, as you could imagine, as they kind of are taking their respective journeys through the prison system. And then at a certain point in time, Derek Hamilton arrives at Auburn Correctional. And when he arrives at Auburn, word spreads because by this point in time, he's already made a name for himself. He's litigating everything you can imagine. He's litigating, food. He's litigating, anything you could imagine inside of a prison that you can actually, file a grievance against. He's been doing. He's a thorn in the side of every warden in any prison he's going to. So they send him to Auburn. But when he gets to Auburn, word starts to spread around the yard that he's arrived. And people become really excited because people know that he's been able to help other people either reduce their sentences, remove years off, and in some cases help people get out. But he has not been able to get himself out. He meets Shabaka. He encounters Shabaka, who he had not seen in a long time. And Shabaka had already, at this point in time, been trying to litigate his own case and not having a lot of success. They, along with a couple of other men who have similarly identified themselves as wrongfully convicted, form the actual Innocence team. And their whole thing is they take over the law library, they push their desks together, and every single day they start to read each other's cases and help them file what are called their D40s, right? And they're 40, and these are like they're essentially their appeals to get back into the court system, right? They have to get back, and they need to have grounds to get back in the court system. They need to be able to legitimize why their conviction should be reviewed, not just overturned, just should be reviewed. And that is the big thing that they have to be able to fight for, and that they're ultimately able to do. And one of the sort of methods for doing so is being able to point to Scarcella. And the fact that Scarcella was involved in their case gives rise to a level of suspicion such that it would even open up the ability for their cases to be heard again. And this is a big fight for them. This takes many, many years. This isn't an overnight success. This is several years in the making. They end up, helping a whole bunch of other guys in prison. They end up starting a law clinic while they're in Auburn, where other men are coming in and learning from them. It's a movement that they begin. It's a movement that they begin.
Yeah, I was going to say it's good to have somebody else review your stuff. It's like trying to write your own book or your own life. It's very difficult to write your own memoir. It's very difficult to write your own, litigate your own case, because you get entrenched in every little nuance of the case, and instead of sending in a 25-page brief or motion, it becomes 60 pages that nobody wants to read because everything about it. So you start harping on all these details that you think you can see how they correlate, but everybody else that reads it is like, listen, by page 40, I don't remember what was on page 12. So it is very good to have other people review your stuff and say, that's irrelevant. That's irrelevant. Here's your key arguments.
And I think that's what they were able to do, both for themselves and being able to have other people that were as committed and that were as dedicated to both their innocence, but also getting out. It's just a story about freedom. This is a story about how this thing that the vast majority of us, you could say take for granted or don't have to think very much about, how when you're in prison, you're in solitary, you're alone, and then to think about you're there for a crime you did not commit.
Right.
And you're there for 2 decades. The journey that they go through, like a Shabaka, for instance, you go through the journey of anger, disbelief. You understand why he even talks about how when you watch another one of your friends in prison get out, you have 2 hearts. You're both happy for them, and then you're like angry because you want to get out too. And you can start to understand like the inner workings of a prison, when someone who's about to get out, they might end up finding themselves involved in some kind of a fight or something that happens because somebody might not want them to get out, because it's just that idea of getting out. It's such an aspiration for everybody, and for those who are able to seize that aspiration, it produces a whole variety of other feelings and emotion for those left behind. And that's another powerful thing about the story, is that Derek Hamilton in particular says over and over again, his deepest commitment is to ensure he leaves no one behind. To this day, he continues to run, friends and family of the wrongfully convicted in Brooklyn, despite the fact that he's won $11 million and, for his wrongful conviction. He still had another suit outstanding. He could decide to ride off into the sunset, but he chooses to still dedicate himself to this work. And he says, I'm freeing slaves. If you ask him, what are you doing? I'm freeing people. And when you spend time with him, his phone is ringing nonstop, because there's people in jail who find his number and they're calling him and they're asking him and they're desperate. And he's making time for them. And that's because he deeply connects with and understands the desperation in the sense that nobody cares and nobody believes you. Because everybody says they're innocent, right? Everybody says, well, not everybody. There's a lot of, not everybody, but a lot of people say that they're innocent.
Well, here's what I found is that federal prison's different than state, but I kind of assume the mindset is very similar. But most of the guys were like, they were definitely there for a reason. Like, oh, I'm here. The problem was the draconian sentences that they're giving out, where some guys like, was I selling crack, or did I do this, or I did that, but I didn't deserve 15 years. Like, you got guys there doing 25 years for bringing a gun to a $15 crack, sale. It's like, or even better, this is always my favorite, getting charged with a gun during the commission of selling drugs, and the gun was in your closet 7 miles away from where you actually were arrested. Like, how am I being charged with a gun to protect drugs that wasn't at the drug sale?
Yeah. Yeah.
You see, like,
No, it's just absolutely the case. I mean, and some of this stuff is like, having some law background myself, it's the art of defining when the crime began. And that's what you're ultimately getting at is, did the crime begin at the scene or did it begin at some other point in time? And this was a continuous set of acts that were connected to the ultimate, murder or thing that happened. So this is how, when you think about felony murder, the idea of the felony murder rule, which allows someone who may not even have actually been at the scene. Say, imagine you were in the car, you got dropped off, but the car just kept going and there was a murder that committed. You could be charged as part of that murder because they were en route to committing that crime, even though you got out the car several miles earlier. And to some extent, it's a tool and a tactic to get people to talk, right? It's a way to get someone to snitch on somebody else. So we know that you maybe didn't pull the trigger, but we can use you and use the fact that you are in some way, shape, or form involved to rope you in. And we're going to use that as a way to get you to talk. But if you got nothing to say, it's really hard.
Right. Well, I was gonna say it's funny too, because like the Supreme Court, I forget what year it was, where the case where they actually agreed that the police can, or the prosecution and the police can actually use the death penalty to threaten you. So you're threatening me with death if I don't take a plea. Like, that's a pretty powerful incentive for me to take a plea on something, whether I did it or not. Let's say I did do it, great, and I should maybe do 5 years. Now I'm going to have to take a plea for 15 years because you're threatening me with death.
Yeah.
So
these are impossible situations.
Right. Especially, it's like, okay, well, I can't go to trial. I am guilty. Like, I was here, I was there, but I should get 5 years, not 15. And damn sure, if I go to trial, I may get the death penalty. Or, yeah, I had a guy that I met when I was locked up. He was missing a leg. He was, by the time I met him, it was probably 2021. But when he was 19, his brother came home one day. This kid's never had a job. He's sitting on the couch. He's playing a video game. Brother comes home with one of his buddies and said, listen, I got a lick. You got to come with me. I need you. All you got to do is drive the getaway car. He's like, well, what are you talking about? Like, he's like, what's happening? He said, listen, he said, there's a dope house. They got whatever the amount was, $100,000 in cash, couple of keys. No, there's a guy there. He doesn't even have a weapon. We're going to go there, kick in the door, take the dope, take the cash. All you got to do is drive the car. It's me and my buddy so-and-so. We've done it a bunch of times. He says, so he's scared and he's nervous, but it's his brother. He's broke. He's got no job. And, he's grown up next to the projects. Everybody knows. The only people he knows that have any money at all are drug dealers or robbers or whatever. So he goes with them. No father in the home, nothing. Goes with them, drives the car. They pull up. His brother and his buddy jump out of the car. On their way to the front door, I want to say this was an ATF or the DEA. I forget which one. They were doing it over and over again. So they pull up, jump out of the car, get into a shootout with the brother. They kill the brother. I don't think they killed both of them, but anyway, they kill the brother. The kid takes off in the car. They block him in. He says initially, I thought they were being robbed. So he jumps out and runs. They fire on him. They literally blow his leg off with a shotgun. So he gets his leg blown off. He gets charged with the robbery and the death of his brother. This is federal, and he ends up taking a plea for, like, I want to say might have been 20 or 30 years, and took a plea, never been in trouble before. And when I saw him, he was in a wheelchair because his prosthetic, they were still fitting him for a prosthetic. And I don't think you can travel with a prosthetic. And he had just been there. And by the time he got there and I'd heard the story and actually met him, I was moved to another prison. But my buddy, I have a buddy who actually met him and spent some time with him. But yeah, the story was just, it's like, you guys killed my brother. I never got out of the car. And I was charged with his with this. And the thing is,
yeah.
they pat themselves on the back. Good job. I did a good job. Yeah, you
I
sent
mean,
a
this
19-year-old to prison
this
for
is a
30 years.
it's a different orientation. I think it's also connected to like, what do you believe? Um, like it's when I hear that, when I hear like the idea of patting folks, I think there's like a notion that there's a sort of Manichaean view of the world as like this really dark place, and people are fundamentally good or evil, and if you perceive yourself as to be on the side of good, the means by which you do to uphold good are less important than the ends to which you are trying to arrive at. And I think a lot of the rationalization around shooting the guy's leg off, whatever it might have been in that moment, is that there's an ultimate good, and this person is an ultimate bad and evil. And I just don't. I think the world is way more complicated than that. I think it's just a way more nuanced set of circumstances. So what you just laid out is like there's some connection to poverty here we're talking about, right?
Well, I mean, I think so. But just based on
there's poverty, there's a
based
need.
on right, I was gonna say based on the fact that I actually taught GED when I was in prison for God. I only taught it for about 3 years. Anyway,
How long were you in?
13 years.
Wow.
But the first 10 is the hardest. So those last 3 flew by.
Bro.
But it's funny how I would teach the GED classes, and listen, these guys, they didn't have a prayer. You know what I mean? Like prior to going to prison, I would have told you, raised upper middle class, and I would have told you if you end up in prison, it's absolutely your fault. And many people get out of you can't say that it's poverty, because lots of people, they go to school, they get educations, they can get out if you really try, you really this. But then you spend time with these guys that are super bright, and you're like, there was a guy named Smith that was one of the GED tutors. And I mean, he must have been a mathematical genius, bro. This guy was amazing. Came in with a high school, dropped out of high school, like whatever, 9th, 10th grade, selling drugs, got like 15 years or something, got his GED, but was so good at math, they kept him on as a full-time math tutor, which really means you're teaching the class, because our teacher in the teacher in our class, me and my buddy Zach's class, never left his office. We taught all the classes, wrote all the reports, did all the grading, everything.
How much y'all get paid for that?
Oh man, I want to say I made like $20 a month. Zach, I think, made like 80 a month, and we worked, you worked maybe 30, 35 hours, only because you have counts.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, also you would tutor at night and stuff, and they didn't count that. So it was probably 40, but I also taught courses at night too, which was not associated with the GED. But I mean, you need something to get moving, to get going.
No, I mean,
but
these guys, this is what you just are describing. I think this Smith, who you said was a math genius, I think there's without question, having spent time with Derek and Shabaka, they are legal savants. It's
right.
their ability to understand the law, to utilize the law, and to ultimately win their own freedom. This is not an accident, and it is not because of anything. Yes, they needed lawyers on the outside to officially, maybe litigate some part of their case. But in Shabaka's case in particular, he made it very clear with his attorneys that he was going to be a part of this team, that he was going to be a driver of this. He was not going to put his fate, and this is what has happened to all of them. Initially, all of them as young men, 19, 20 years old, they put their fate in some lawyer who they had to discover later on really was not incentivized necessarily to get them out, but to get them to make sure that they, I don't want to call anybody just, I don't want to paint a broad stroke, but they were not incentivized necessarily to get them out. They had to understand that it was on them. It was going to only be because they wanted to get out that they were going to be able to litigate themselves out.
Yeah. No, you have to be the driving force in your case, and you have to be an advocate for yourself. You need advocates, but you have to be your number one advocate. And I was going to say, so it's funny because in the public defender program for the for the feds, I don't know how it works in the state, they're on a salary. So whether they win or lose, it doesn't matter to them. I mean, obviously they look good if they win. Now, if you can't get a public defender and they give you a
court-appointed attorney,
yes.
Yeah.
The problem with that system is here's $7,500 for a plea, or here's 15 or 20 to go to trial. Okay, well, here's the problem.
Yeah.
That if you have 200 hours of recordings for, let's say somebody's on your client's on tape.
Yeah.
How long does it take to review 200 hours of recordings?
Yeah.
200 hours at a minimum if you don't stop.
Yeah.
So the quicker I can get this guy to plea, or the least amount of work hours I can put into this, the more money I make. So my incentive is to not be prepared for trial, to convince him to take a plea, to not review the case. So even if you're saying I didn't do it, or I this, or they're saying it was this many keys, because that's really what a lot of times it boils down to. Not that you're just blatantly innocent, but
yes.
But I've never seen 25 keys, bro. Like that didn't happen. I don't know what this guy's telling you. And of course they do the math. Well, how long has he been selling drugs? 2 years. How much have you bought from him? For 3 weeks straight, I bought this much. Okay, well, let's do the math. And you do the math. And you go, oh, well, then he sold 25 keys and now he's got a 25-year mandatory minimum. It's like, what are you talking about? Like, this is a guy who asked for that much. I've never sold that much in my life. He came, he bought 3 different times. Now you're using that calculation.
Yeah. Well, but you're getting at something also, which is core to our story, is that the way that the system will enable people who in any other context would not be credible. In any other context, you would not use that person that you talked about as a credible person. But in this context, they can be credibly put in front of a jury and presented as state's evidence. And it's like wild, because we see that in our story. There's a woman named Teresa Gomez, and the most recent episode 4, is all about Teresa Gomez. Teresa Gomez was, a self-identifying crackhead, who claims to have witnessed over 11 murders.
So she's not even saying I have a slight addiction. She's saying crackhead.
That's what she is. This is what her life was at that point in time. It's not, and I should not say that's what she is, but that's how she identified.
Right.
But Detective Scarcella uses her over and over and over again as an eyewitness in murder after murder after murder. Now, this is what's wild, is that only at a point when she started, I think when he brings like his 7th or 8th, and, don't quote me on that, whatever the wild number was, only then does the district attorney's office say, oh, slow down here. You brought this witness to us several times. Prior to that, they had no problem putting her on stand. And there was actually cases in which she was on the witness stand that it was probably the case that she was high.
Right. What do they think? She just has really bad luck. She's just in a really bad neighborhood. She happens to be standing there.
So the contextually, again, this is the complicating factor. At that point in time, in that community, in that particular part of Brooklyn, there were a lot of murders happening. She was a person on the street. So theoretically, one could argue that she saw more than one murder, right? But the idea is that she also had her own motivations too. You would imagine that if you're someone who maybe owes somebody some money, or maybe has some beef with somebody on the street, one of the people that you would like to get off the street might be somebody that you are also accusing of, or at least saying that you witnessed committing a murder. But again, the fact of the matter is, you and I would think, the way its system would operate is that we would not rely on someone who in any other context of their lives, we would not rely on them for anything. We're going to rely on them when it comes to defining or deciding someone's fate, whether they should go to prison.
Right.
But the juries did. And this is why I go back and point to the juries. I'm like, hey, juries, you sat there and saw this person sit in front of you. You could have evaluated whether or not this is someone you should believe, and you chose to believe them. And the question I've been asked is why? What is it about, and some of that is, in the hearts and minds of the people who sat in those juries. I was not in those juries, but ultimately many of them decided to convict on flimsy evidence without necessarily reviewing the facts with any great rigor or detail. And this is the challenge that I think I just keep going back to. And as I think about, we worked on this story for 4 years. I think the thing that kept me constantly really like involved and engaged and really interested in trying to tell the story was because I find that as a country, all of us, not all of us, the vast majority of us, like to believe that that we are on the right side of these issues around justice. And when you look at these kinds of cases, these are average folks, everyday people who are on these juries who are choosing to convict people with no evidence whatsoever, which tells me something about how the public, how all of us are complicit, how we can easily be complicit in the form of injustice that then we then try to say is mass incarceration. We then try to say is the problem of policing. And I'm like, no, that's us too. That's us choosing, making choices and not making choices. I actually was called to jury duty. I had a jury service a month and a half ago. I got the dreaded, letter in the mail saying show up. I postponed it as much as I could, but then I was like, I can't in good conscience, given the fact that I have this podcast coming out written about jury exclusion in the past, I have to at least show up. So I show up and I go to, and I'm in DC and I go down to this, I go down to the court and wait in this long line to get checked in. I will say that they have a video running on loop that tells us that's about implicit bias. So at least they're trying to help prime you to not be biased. But I'm ultimately excluded from the jury only because I marked in that form that they give everyone when they sit down, like, have you ever had any interaction with the justice system? I marked A, I have a law degree, and I marked B, that I had an interaction with the law, with the law previously. And in fact, I had sat in one of those very courtrooms as a defendant in my 20s in a case in which I had been charged with assaulting an officer. Now, in my view, I am the ideal juror. I would be a great juror. Like, why wouldn't you?
They don't want anybody. They don't want anybody with any knowledge.
Right. But then I got immediately struck from the jury. I got immediately removed from the case. Without any. It wasn't even as if the judge would even talk to me. He just looked at me and said, "You're dismissed." So there's an unwillingness to allow people with critical consciousness to even participate in the system. So then you want me to believe in the system. You want me to have faith in the system, but you don't want people to participate in it who might actually challenge it and actually have some legitimate arguments, that might need to be heard in that space, but they don't want that.
About 2 months ago, I got a jury duty summons. I was excited.
Really?
Like I called down there to say, look, is it going to be an issue that I have a felony conviction? Yeah. And they go, yeah, you don't need to show up. I said, I said, I'm willing. And she goes, no, you're good.
Oh.
I was thinking that would be
but
great.
I mean, again, like, you've done your time. If the whole idea is that you need to pay some debt to society and have it, but now you are excluded. Now I always talk about
it's an illusion.
I know you know this better than I would, right? But I've said this before, and I'm not the first to say it. But there are, if you think about the ways that we can exercise our democratic rights in our society, they actually show up in two different ways. One is to vote, and the other one is to participate in the jury process. I mean, those are like pillars of participation in a democracy, is to be able to but you've effectively been removed from that because of a prior conviction. Now,
but I still have to pay taxes.
But you still got to pay taxes. Right?
I understand that. That's like one of the things they said is like, it's like you cannot have, taxation without representation, but I don't have any representation.
Right. Why?
I don't get to participate in my representation,
right.
But I'm telling you, and they're still taking my tax returns. I was just supposed to get a $2,100 tax return because I owe like $6 million. They went, no, you don't get that.
Oh, it's because they're charging. They're making you pay the bill for your time in prison. Is that what they're doing?
No. Mine was fraud, and I have restitution for like $6 million. But I'm good for it. But not at $2,100 a hit. Like I pay every month, and then I'm like, I pay every month, and you're going to take my tax return.
Yeah.
And they also took my COVID stimulus check.
What?
Yeah. Because, when at one point they gave away like 1,800, right? So I got a couple of checks, and then they gave away 1,800. And they said, if you didn't get the 1,800, claim it on your tax return. So I did. And they said, you got it. And we're taking it.
Wow.
We're like, this is so unfair, but that's fine. It's fine. It's fine.
You seem to be able to smile about it. And that's not
I have to, bro. I got to smile. I've been smiling since after about 3 years, I started smiling because I just realized like, this is what it is.
Yeah.
And you can be that grumpy guy that walks around and complains the whole time about
Yeah.
being incarcerated,
Yeah.
or you can make a little life for yourself in
Yeah.
here, because this is what it is,
Yeah.
you know?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I'm already, shaving off a significant amount of my life. Like, you're going to shave off more by being miserable and being anxious, and and I've got an out date. You know what it's like to sit at a table and complain about getting like 20 years, and you're sitting at a table with three guys that are leaving in a box.
That's wild.
It's like, oh, I better stop complaining. Like, nobody wants to hear me
Wow.
complain.
Wow.
You
Wow.
know,
They got life. That's it. They're not getting out. Like, without a
no,
possibility.
no. All three of these guys, like one of them is essentially, a serial killer,
Yeah.
but he was an old man. So
Yeah.
they worked their way down from like the pen. And it's like, okay, well, this guy's 70 years old at this point. He's really not, he's not a danger anymore.
Yeah.
And so they end up going to a medium, and a medium is basically a prison. Like, it's what you think of as a prison. There's multiple layers of fences. There's medium sounds like, oh, it's not so bad. No,
No.
no, it's bad.
Doesn't sound
But
so bad. Okay.
yeah,
Yeah.
I think maybe one of the guys was there for like drugs. He probably had like 45 years or something, but he does 45 years. Why don't you just say life?
Yeah.
He's not getting out,
No.
so,
No. I mean, these guys, they had Shabaka was sentenced to, 22 20s to run consecutively, because there were two murders. So therefore he got 2 20s to run consecutively. I mean, that's, if you're 18, 19 years old and you're convicted of something that's 2 20s running consecutively, that's your life. You don't see anything that's like, oh, I'm gonna get out of 60. That's not like a thing you're thinking about. You're like, I'm dead.
no,
and this
devastating.
That's devastating. And then you add to that, like, I think even after doing the story, it's, even more so than Derek's experience, once people who listen to the podcast, his story is much more complicated than Shabaka. Shabaka's is pretty straightforward. It's pretty straightforward.
It's just he wasn't there, and they arrested.
He wasn't there. There were people who could argue, who could assert that he wasn't there. Even the statement that is attributed to him, that was provided Scarcella, who was not the lead detective, but who was a secondary detective who came into the interrogation room after the first detective couldn't get anything out of him. And the only thing that Scarcella got and that was used as a confession was, you got it, you're right, they had it coming. But it was never a statement that I did it, this is why I did it. So the only even the kinds of statements that were used to be attributed to that, where they were attributed to them, or to him in this case, as evidence of actually confessing, aren't real confessions.
It's vague. It's a vague. Just, it's more like, yeah. The guy saying, "We got you. Yeah. All right, you got me. All right, yeah, right. You got me. You're good."
A couple of those, and as a matter of fact, part of what ends up being, so one of the key characters, who's, her name is Frances Frenchie Robles. She's a New York Times reporter who broke this story back in 2013 initially, and she broke it with much of the help of Derek and Shabaka, because they were kind of feeding her some information. But one of the things she puts together as she's doing her own research is just what you said, a pattern that she was noticing in these various cases that were involving Scarcella, where the statement, you got it, you're right, you've caught, it was never, I did it, I'm the one, I committed it. It was always, there was a refrain that she found in more than one of the cases that for her indicated some form of a pattern, that the statements that he was concocting, because that's the assertion, that Scarcella was literally just making up statements. Because he would be in his witness rooms, and of course, lo and behold, there's no camera. Lo and behold, there's no recording. Oh, and lo and behold, there's no actual transcript of what they talked about. There's only this little notebook that he might have jotted some things down in, and then he somehow can't remember what he said or what he wrote down. So the only thing that we really have is his word. He actually is coming out of a witness room without anything to corroborate. No other detective was in the room with him. He was in a one-on-one conversation. He comes out, I got the confession. You read this confession written on the back of a manila envelope that doesn't really look like a confession at all. But that becomes what a prosecutor is willing to indict on.
Right. Yeah, if someone's willing to confess, they're telling all.
And you know better than I do, right?
They're telling everything. Yeah. They're not going to say, all I'm going to say is, yeah, I did it. Let me go back to my cell. Oh, no. Once you pierce that veil, it opens the floodgates. Nobody says a little bit. They immediately say everything. Here's how I did it. Here's what I thought. Here's when I did this. Here's where I got the gun. Here's where the gun is now. Here's what, because, you've got that wall. Once the wall comes down, you're ready to tell all. You don't just say, yeah, you got me. You got me. You're right. I did it. Let me go back to my cell. No, that's, to me, it's an unburdening. You're 100% all in.
And the thing is with Scarcella, he was very much of the belief, and I'm sure that there were cases that he actually was able to, discover who the actual criminal, the actual, perpetrator was. But he actually went on, this Scarcella has an episode of, he was on an episode of Dr. Phil. And this actually becomes very detrimental for him later on, because he's on the episode after he's retired and before all the cases have started to emerge. But he says on Dr. Phil, it's like, I've got a crystal ball. I've got a crystal ball in my stomach. And it's just like this kind of and what is also fast is a kind of mysticism to it all. There's a bit of a mysticism to the way in which he believes he's able to divine innocence or guilt. And he attributes it to his grandmother, who, he believes had this sort of mystical ability to, and his mother and grandmother, or that he's able to attribute to. And I don't disbelieve that he believes that. I don't disbelieve for a moment that he believes that. It's an intuition that he's able to suss out. But again, when we're talking about these kinds of stakes, I need a little bit more than your intuition, than a crystal ball that you say that you have around who is guilty and who is innocent.
I was going to say, I was a mortgage broker, right? And people would come in, I could get them loans, right, on their houses. And I kind of had a crystal ball too, that I knew I could get you a mortgage. I'm positive. The problem is it was based on fraud. So I was an amazing mortgage broker. And then people were like, are you sure? I was turned down by my bank. I was turned down by this other mortgage company. I go, I know I can do it.
Yeah.
I feel good about this. I'm going to get you that loan. I'm like, I feel really good about him, because I was so overwhelmingly confident. Of course I was confident. Well, I know I'm going to make your W-2s and pay stubs, and we're going to get you that loan.
Yeah. Well, this is, again, thank you. That's hilarious.
That's him. That's your guy. That's your detective.
That's the guy. I feel very strong, because there's a confirmational component to this as well. It's like, I already know the steps that would need to be taken in order for this to happen. I have enough pieces of the puzzle that I can put them together and present this on a platter, and we can walk this. And if you have 50, and he's at this point, Scarcella might at the peak of his career, at the peak of the murder, at the murder crisis in New York City, he's carrying himself 40, 50 cases. You got to close some of these things, man.
Well, you have to think too. So the first time you lie about something, right? The first time you commit a crime and you get away with it, you become emboldened by it. The first time he probably had some he had some threads, and he felt pretty good. This was the guy, but he knew this, so he thought, if I give it this one little push, he gives it a little push, and then boom, the guy's found guilty. You feel great. Now I'm willing to push a little harder. Before long, you're doing the fake confessions. Yep. You start realizing that your word is gold, and the more they go through, the more you look like a rainmaker.
Right. And the more you feel like you have to uphold that reputation. And I think that's the other thing. There was an episode of Top Cops about this guy. This was like a very popular show in the late 90s, of America's Most Wanted vintage, that sort of reenactments, so he ends up doing one of those episodes where there's an actor reenacting, him, and he's talking it through himself. And you start to imagine, like, you grew up, and he grew up, and he's very generous in telling his story. And I want to be really, fair in the sense that, and I do this in the story as well. And if he's ever listens to this podcast, and then anything you need to tell a story I tell, I want to be honest and say that he did give up his time to be part of this, and to some extent, in a hope perhaps that this would maybe clear his name, or help restore his name. And our endeavor was never to throw him under the bus, or to intentionally characterize him in a poor light. The facts are the facts. The story is the story. That said, the way I interpreted what happened and what unfolded over the course of the career was, you start to get rewarded, and those rewards start to feel really good. And
Really
you start
right.
to be called the rain. You are the rainmaker. You're the person that people call in when they can't crack the case. And that's part of your identity. It's a big part of your identity. And we see that in any part of life. I mean, any of us is like, you're the fixer.
I was just thinking I was just thinking you're the guy they call in that can get it done. I was thinking, can you imagine being the prosecutor that really, and maybe even in his heart, he thought, or the unit, the head of the unit or the lieutenant or something that's like, look, this is a complicated case. This is tough. Call him in. He can get it done. And now looking back, realizing like I was calling in the fixer
Yeah.
that was willing to twist people's arms, use false witnesses, make up confessions.
Yeah.
Like,
And
wow.
in this guy's case, what's interesting and evident as well is that he wasn't planting evidence. I mean, there's guys who are out there planting evidence.
Right.
He wasn't planting evidence. He wasn't planting guns on people. And in some way, some level, we come to a conclusion, not to give it all away, that there maybe is a measure of incompetence too. Like, you just actually weren't that good at your job.
Right.
And I think it's even scarier to think that some of what was happening was like, because of the pace of things, because of the lack of any kind of scientific rigor, forensic rigor to this, that, someone who was doing sloppy work was able to get away with it for a really long time. And because nobody was checking it, and because it was removing people from the equation. And we do have to contend with that. Like, does it feel, and it's something he would argue that he's the guy who was going into the public housing and building after, a crime has taken place, and he's talking to the mothers and the grandmothers, and he's talking to them, and they're frightened, and they're sick of hiding in the bathtub every time something pops off, and they just want to be able to live in peace. In many ways, he saw himself as their protector, and he saw what he was doing as God's work, and in many ways trying to give these people a life that was a little less violent, a little less chaotic. And there's at the core something noble about that. It's the means by which he was going about doing it. Like, there's nobility in the notion that I want to help people who are, in this case, they are absolutely and utterly unequivocally victims. Like,
Right.
they are unequivocally victims of whoever's committing the crimes, it's not them, but they're
So
having to deal with the consequences of it.
So here's the problem with that.
Mm-hmm.
One, you're not removing the guilty party. So you're not removing the violence or and here's the worst part. And this happens, you see this happen all the time, actually, when you hear about these cases. I'm not gonna try and say this guy's last name because I'll butcher the hell out of it. But his name it's Jeff, and he's in New York. It's Duroff. So anyway, I did a video with him. So he was 16. He's 16 years old. It might have been 17. 16 years old. A girl is walking through. There's apartment complexes and subdivisions in his neighborhood, and there's like there's like little forest areas between them, right? Like in Tampa, they separate the suburbs by these little foresty areas. But the kids are 15 years old, 16, and so they make their way through. They have a little path. So she's walking through one day, comes across a homeless well, let me put it this way. She's walking through it. She's found dead. She's found dead and raped. There's semen on her. When the detectives go and they go to her high school, they say, look, are there any kids? Like, we feel that because her face was covered up, because the person had thrown like a shirt over her face, they said, we feel like this may be somebody that she knows. And they said, is there anybody in the school that's kind of like an oddball or something? And they said, well, there's this one guy, Jeff, and, he doesn't have any friends. He this and that. They described what the other kids described it. He goes, that wasn't really true because I did have friends. I had friends that, he's like they said I met this FBI composite of, and he said, I didn't really, he's like I'm not super popular. He's like, and I knew her, but just to say hi. We had a class or two together. He said they come to him, they talk to him, and they say, look, he's like, I don't know anything about it. And they say, well, keep your ears open. They said, also, can we talk to you? Like, who do you think, maybe you could help us? Who do you think, what kind of a person do you think would do this? He's like, I mean, I don't know. I don't think it would be anybody around here. Like, and then they start kind of coaxing him. And then they, at some point over the next week or two, they bring him downtown, have a conversation with him. Then they bring him, they say, you know, have you heard anything? He's like, well, this is what people are saying. He said at that point in his life, he said, I actually had a dream that someday maybe I'd be in law enforcement.
Wow.
He said, so they bring him down at some point, they bring him down, they question him for, I'm going to say 10 hours straight, telling him that he did it. They try all the different techniques. And at some point, the one officer, they do good cop, bad cop.
Yeah.
He's scared to death.
Yeah.
At one point, they get him, the cop says, listen, like, these guys think you did it. The only way for me to get you out of here without getting hurt is for you to just admit it. If I can get a confession from you, then I can get you out of here. So he gives them a confession. They tell him basically how she was found. He gives them a confession. He says, okay, well, when are we, you know, he's like, okay, well, how are we going to get me out of here? And the cop says, you're under arrest. He, of course, never leaves. He gets, I forget how many years. I don't know if it was 30 or 40 years, whatever it was. Goes to trial, by the way. When he gets his lawyer, he says, look, the confession's bullshit. Like, he told me this, he told me that. I was scared. I'd been locked up. You know, it's been 10 hours. They've been badgering him. He said, I was terrified. This is what he says. And of course, the cop gets on the stand and says, none of that happened. So he goes to trial. He's, by the way, as a child rapist. So by the time he's found guilty, or goes to trial, it goes to prison. He's 19. He fights the case the whole time. God knows what happened to this guy. Does law work, starts fighting his case. He goes all the way through the appeals court. He, you know, it's all, you know, denied. We have a confession. We have a blood, like we have, you know, the semen matches his blood type, that sort of thing. So it finally goes to Innocence Project, and they turn him down like 3 times because they're like, we've got, you know, like, you've got a confession, you've got this, you've been turned down. They've looked at it 10 different ways. So finally, some clerk at the that worked for the Innocence Project comes across this stuff, reviewing it, starts corresponding, and eventually goes back and says, I'm begging you to look at this, at least test the DNA. And that's all he said was, I just want the DNA tested. I know it's not my DNA. They tested it. And when it came back that it wasn't his DNA at the trial, wasn't his DNA, they said, well, she had slept with another boy earlier in the day. That was the reason it didn't match. I forgot that part. So here's what was interesting about that is that he said, I just want it tested again. Because now they have this national database where they can pull from all kinds of people. And it's been 15 years. He'd been locked up like 15 years at this point.
Yeah.
It's been 15 years. Maybe this guy's in the system now and he wasn't before. So they go, okay. So finally, you know, the clerk is like, all we're doing is just test it. It doesn't cost $5,000 anymore. It costs barely anything now. It's $50 to run this thing. They run it, come back. It's a hit. It's another guy who's currently incarcerated.
Of course.
Who a year after this murdered a school teacher who has 2 children. Because the detectives couldn't do their due diligence, couldn't do their job, and focused on some kid that was a weak mark, you let this man go on to murder a school teacher with 2 children. So when you said, you probably told yourself you're doing the right thing by locking up this guy who you don't even know that did anything.
Yeah.
You probably told yourself, we got the right guy. He confessed. You badgered a young boy in a confession, sent him to prison, and allowed the real murderer to go murder a school teacher who has 2 children. And now the guy's in prison. So, you know, the idea that the cops are like, well, we took a bad guy off the street. No, you did a bad job and you let the bad guy go on to murder someone else.
Yeah. And thank you for sharing that. I mean, like, I just, you know, as a father of a child, of a girl, a young girl and a young boy, you know, those kinds of stories just, you know, I just can't, it's hard for me just even think about that and fathom what, as a parent, you need in terms of closure. You need to feel like there's somebody, you know, and I think there's like a feature of all of these conversations and all of this discourse is the sort of social and political pressure that is on those who are empowered through our law enforcement and justice system to produce somebody. I think that in Scarcella's case and in many other cases, there were pressures. Whether they want to talk about those, name those, and acknowledge the extent to which they influence their choices and behavior, I don't know. But I do know that those pressures are real. Somebody's calling you every day. The press is hounding you. Your boss is under pressure because then it looks like they're incompetent because they're not able to produce anything. There's a notion outside of the law enforcement industrial complex that they just have magic and they just can magically find people. Like, people commit crimes every day that they don't get convicted for.
Right.
You think about people get away with shit all the time. I think we don't like to accept that and understand that and deal with that, but a lot of things go unsolved, and so there's an intense amount of pressure to find somebody plausible enough to be able to walk out there and say this is the part.
Yeah, it's the round up the usual suspects.
Yeah, and then once that happens, similar to like the way we've learned so much in the last 20 years through the DNA, whether it's the DNA evidence, the DNA data bank, like that has been super helpful. Then the other side of things, we've learned a lot more about cognition and about how cognitive bias functions and how the different kinds of things that can happen in the brain once we anchor to something, like anchoring bias. Once we get anchored to a story, it becomes incredibly difficult for people to unanchor themselves to that story. Once we have a sense of who did it, we look for the evidence to confirm it, and we have a tendency to disconfirm any evidence that might actually challenge a belief that we hold. So you might get that other. So once they got the other evidence about like this wasn't actually his, they had to come up with another explanation. That happened. There was another guy I did work with years ago. He passed away recently. The trial, his name was Daryl Hunt. There was an HBO special on him years ago, The Trials of Daryl Hunt. Similarly, 19 years old, charged and convicted with this murder. And even then, even when they were able to demonstrate his DNA was not actually the DNA that was involved in the case, this sort of rape of this woman, they argued, no, well, it was a second person involved, and therefore he was still present at the crime of the scene of the crime. Like, it's this, the unwillingness, the just deeply deep investment that's been made in being right. Not about them being right. And to be clear, they also know that if there's a wrongful conviction, there's going to be millions of dollars that somebody has to pay. And you can also imagine that.
You see that all the time where they realize they 100% know the person is, and then they try and go to them and say, look, we'll let you out right now. We're either going to retry you, but we'll let you out right now if you just sign saying you won't sue us. And here's the thing. Look, if you've been locked up 20 years, and you've seen how unfair the justice system can be, you're ready to sign. You are ready to sign. Like, I can see people signing saying, look, just let me out, bro. Because if they take me back to trial, look, I always say this in the feds, and it's not so much like this in the state, but I'm sure to a degree it is. In the feds, if you're guilty, take a plea. 100% you're getting found guilty. If you're innocent in the feds, you got about a 50% chance of being found guilty. So if you're guilty, don't go to trial. If you're innocent, don't think, oh, well, I'm innocent, I'll be found not guilty. No, you got about 50-50. I interviewed a guy the other day who's like, I'm innocent. And then off camera, he was like, what do you think my chances are? And I said, pretty good. Your chances are pretty good. Like, it looks like they have a really weak case. He said, really? He said, you think I'll get off? He said, what do you think my chances are, though? I went, 50-50.
That's pretty good.
And he was like, he goes, 50-50. And I said, yeah, that's not good. I said, in the feds, that's pretty good. Like, I'm sorry, that's pretty good. Like, if you're thinking 99%, well, you're living in fantasy land, bro. You don't know how these people operate.
Well, I mean, because their incentive is to get you to plead. You think about it, what is it, 90-some% of those indictments result in a plea deal. So they're
97%.
97%. So they're likely their objective is to get you to plead to reduce the burden on the system. You decide to actually burden the system and cost them some money.
Yeah.
They go,
I can't tell you how many times I've talked to guys who were like, they went to trial and they're like, they were offering them 3 years and then they go to trial and they lose and they get 17. How do you justify that you thought it was fair to offer him 3, and then he goes to trial, and you give him 17. Like 17 was never fair. 3 was probably what he deserved, but you're going to punish him.
Yeah, it's punitive.
Right. So that doesn't, it makes no sense at all.
Yeah. It's, well, the logic of it is very clear. It's to send a message, it's to be a deterrence to others for whom, who might be considering, in moving forward, should strongly consider taking that plea for 3 years. I mean, 3 years is still 3 years. It's still 72, that was at 36 months you'll never get back, that you have to fight. And moreover, you have to come out and interact and engage in a society that now has marked you, and that you have to enact, and this, like, you have to navigate this, that you have to navigate as a marked person. I wanted to ask you a question, though. One of the things that was fascinating in talking to Shabaka in particular was when he gets out, and there's actually a German documentary film crew actually documents when he gets out. So he gets out several years ago now, and they're there in the prison when they're there the day he gets out, and they follow him for several days. They spend time with him. And the thing that's so sad in many ways, heartbreaking, is how far behind he is with the things that have taken place in the world in his absence. Like you've literally missed, like, there are chunks of just life, not just your personal life, but like the life writ large that you just haven't participated in. Like,
right.
You've never used, you don't know what social media, you don't know what there's all these things you just don't have any knowledge of, and you have to kind of get scaled up. So I was curious, like, in 13 years in your absence, like, what were the things that you had to learn how to do again when you got back out?
When I got locked up, I had the Razor. Do you remember the Razor phone?
Yeah.
That was yeah. They just came out with texting. And so YouTube came out in 2005, and people were just starting to post like their summer vacation videos, and maybe funny videos, prank videos, right? There was no podcasts, didn't even start until the word didn't even come into existence until 2009. iPhones came in 2000. I was locked up in 2000 and in 2006. I think 2007 or 8 the iPhone came out. So, there's no apps. There's no, I'm still thinking computer. And so when I got to the halfway house, like I couldn't use I went and I got like an $80 phone. And of course, the guys in the halfway house, they all know what they're doing. They've only been locked up a year here, 4 years here, 2 years. So they're used to all this. I'm downloading apps to watch movies and stuff, and my phone keeps getting viruses. And so I go to I'm asking people, I don't understand what's going on. It froze up. And
oh, man.
So I don't know how to get on YouTube. I don't know what an app is. I'm like a program? Like, no, but it's an app. I'm like, what does that mean? I don't know what an app is. Yeah. And so I had a buddy that hired me who owned a gym that I grew up with. He hired me, and I'll never forget my probation officer, because they contact you in the halfway house. And I remember she said, I've been there maybe 2-3 weeks. And she goes, she said, look, I just emailed you a document you have to fill out. I said, okay. So I went to my boss. I said, hey, I need to print this. He said, okay, pull it up. And he went, okay. And he grabbed my phone and all right, bro, it's on the printer. And I went, no, bro, I need to print it. And he goes, it's on the printer. It's over there in the office. Go check it out. It should be printed. And I said, no, bro. I said, listen, I need to print this so I can fill it out. I have to fill it out and I have to send it to her. I need a hard copy. And he goes, it's on the printer. And I went, how is it on the printer? How does it get, like, there's no cable? Like, you didn't plug my phone into anything? Like, I'm almost angry. Like, he's not like, are you an idiot? And you know what I'm saying? Man. And he looked at me, he went, no, bro. He said, I sent it. I just hooked up your phone to the Wi-Fi and printed it from the Wi-Fi. He goes, there's no wires. And I was like, so I walked in the other room and there's, 30 pages. And I just was like, I have no idea. And then he told me, because I kept asking him, my phone's frozen, my phone this. He said, look, we're gonna go to AT&T and we're gonna get you an Apple phone. And I went, well, why? He said, because they don't really get viruses like that. He said, and they're really simple. And he said, I'll be honest with you, bro. He said, I can barely read. He said, I can use my phone, my Apple phone. He said, I can't read well. I don't do anything. He said, but the nice thing is, he said, Steve Jobs knows you're an idiot. And he made it so simple, anybody can use it. He said, even a guy that just got out of prison. He said, it's a little more expensive. We'll get you on a payment program. You'll be fine. He said, but you can use it. He said, I can help you with that. I can't help you with this iPhone or this Android thing. I don't understand. I had to go get an iPhone, and I was able to use it much easier. And there were so many things, uploading a video, even normal things that people say, upload, download, do this, edit this, fix this, Instagram, message. Like, to me, it's all texting. It's like, no, I messaged them. I'm like, oh, you sent him a text? No, I messaged him. Messaging is or I DM'd him, or like every platform has its own language.
Yeah.
And I don't know this. And so I just, in general, it took me about a year before, maybe 6 months before I remember, because I kept avoiding it.
Yeah.
Or waiting to ask somebody. And finally I realized, look, you're either going to be one of these old people that's like, oh, I don't know, no good with the technology, or you're going to have to buckle down and you're going to have to figure it out. And so I just started figuring it out, because I was like, it's that, or, like doing what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
I wasn't capable of doing it, and nobody wants to help you.
Yeah.
They will once or twice.
Yeah.
But then it's like, okay, well, bro, I don't have time to run your life for you.
Yeah.
You're going to have to figure this out. And so, yeah, it was tough. Like it's even now, by putting in I feel better now, probably in the last year or so, since I've actually had a little bit of purchasing power. But even buying something with a credit card online made me uncomfortable and nervous, and doing everything online. I'm still writing checks. For some stuff, man. Then my wife laughs at me. But even then, even going out, and keep in mind, I had a high profile case. So even dating, who dates me? Everything at that time on the internet, everything was horrific that was on me. I mean, now it's flooded with, with much more positive things now. But that's as a direct effort of the things that I've done.
Yeah.
If I had said, you know what, I'm just going to go get a job laying drywall,
that narrative would stay.
That's a narrative. Bad guy, stole money, bad person. That's it. So who dates that guy? Who hangs out with him? Who, like, my buddies think I'm cool. I had a bunch of programs done on me and stuff, and they know me. And so the only people you really know are either criminals. And even to this day, the only friends I have are either criminals that I met while I was incarcerated, or people that knew me prior to prison.
Yeah.
That's it.
So people who meet after who you meet now, is it bi-directional? Like, are you more reticent around connecting with them because of what they might discover, or you find that they just aren't really like, what do you think might prohibit you from building relationships that aren't connected to the past, or the past either through your criminal past or through your like pre-criminal past? Why is it not new stuff?
I think because they believe everything on CNN. Like they read these articles that are on, they read articles and they think, oh, well, you went to jail, you're a bad person. Like that. Nobody thinks, oh, well, you paid your debt to society. They say that, but they don't invite you to their parties. Like, oh no, I know you're a good guy. You paid your debt. And then they stop talking to you at the gym. Like every time I came in here before, you talked to me. Like, you found out this, and you don't have, now you look at me, you're like,
wow.
And you just keep walking where we were buddies before.
Yeah.
So
that's
tough,
and I feel that's tough, man.
I was gonna say, I feel comfortable around guys that have been incarcerated. We have a very similar dark, you very quickly get a dark sense of humor. So you get to joke with them, and you have an understanding of what they're going through.
Yeah.
And there's a support system there that a normal person doesn't understand.
Yeah.
You know, I have guys that call me from, you know, hey, can you order me books? Yeah.
Yeah. Done.
Because you know, can you this, can you that? Of course. Absolutely. Because guess what? Your friends don't understand. They're like, bro, can I just send you the money and you order it? Do you have any idea how difficult it is to order books? And I have to order out of this special magazine, and I can't order the books that I want. And I can't, like, this guy just came out with another book. I'd like to order it. Can you order it for me?
Yeah.
You know, and then keep in mind too, who keeps in touch with the guy in prison? It's a one-sided relationship.
You know, it's so funny. See, you know, my best friend growing up, you know, we were brothers. He started to go in and out of prison when we were 19, and we remained friends until like early 40s, like 40. I mean, he would come out, you know, that was my guy, that was my fam, like, you know, my mom still loved him. It was never a shunning. Something finally did happen where it was like, you've crossed a line that is just and moreover, this has been over 2 decades of us re-embracing you, to be let down, for this to go back in. And I know you're not just letting us down, you're letting yourself down. I understand all that. But when he was in prison, I remember we wrote letters regularly, and I still have the letters, dozens of them. And I would visit him like once or twice a year. And he was in the Appalachian Mountains out in Kentucky somewhere, to drive. And I remember, like, no one else would go see him. No one else would write to him. And I felt like some pride around the fact that I stayed friends with my guy. You know, I felt like a deep, and I didn't want to feel like it was a self-congratulatory thing. Like, hey, I'm the guy who stuck by, my friend, whatever. But I do feel like it has informed how I approach storytelling, and probably deeply why I sort of have this, I keep coming back to these kinds of stories. You know, it was that personal for me, that close for me. This is a person who's born, he's 2 days older than me. We did everything together from the time we were 5 years old, beyond. And I always felt like there was a point of departure in our lives that and I remember the night. I remember we were 16 years old. I'll never forget this night. We were at 7-Eleven, same 7-Eleven we used to play video games when we were little kids. We were playing Punch Out or some shit in the 7-Eleven, and this car pulls up, dark tinted windows. This guy gets out, who we had known in our earlier part of our lives, and he'd gone away for like juvie. He'd gone to juvie, and he'd come back, and we were middle class kids, man. We weren't even like, this wasn't even like our life. But this was DC in the 80s and 90s. Like, the amount of crack had infiltrated so much of our lives. It was just it was just there. Even when it cut across class. Wasn't even necessarily a class. It was a class agnostic. And the guy gets out and he calls my boy over, and he gets in the car and he just leaves. And I remember standing there watching him drive away with this other dude in this vehicle, like, gone. And I just know that was the night that, like, for me, it dawned on me. Maybe it had happened for him earlier. He'd already known it. But for me, that was the night when I look back 20, 30 years later, and I'm like, that night. And there was nothing I could have said to stop that. You know, as his peer, as his friend, I could say all I want to say, but there was a part of him that he had chosen a path that he wanted to be on for whatever reason. And then once he was on that, he was never able to kind of get himself off of it. Part because, you know, for what I remember and I kind of recall, like, there was probably some strong learning disabilities that were already present earlier in his life. And so therefore he was already masking some deep shame and deep sense of, like, not feeling like he was able to sort of fit in, keep up. But then as that gap grows, every time you come back home, the rest of us have taken another 3-year leap in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
Another 3-year leap in our lives. Another 3-year leap.
And you're a convicted felon who's done 3 years or 6 years in prison or 2 years and multiple times, and people don't. So you have to work 3 times as hard as everybody else. And the other part too, for him to come home, is now he's comparing himself to everybody else, which is the wrong thing to do. That's a hard position to come back from. And then of course the people, you know, like I still know these guys, right? Like, and periodically somebody will say something or suggest something, and I'm like, nah, I'm good. I'm good. You know, I'm like, I don't, and it's, and I laugh and stuff, because I also, I have a true crime channel, and, I have an extensive fraud history. So I will get contacted by guys that are currently committing scams. And they're like, bro, like if I could, like, I'll pay you, bro, I'll cut you a check right now. I'll send you $3,000 right now if you'll just have an hour conversation with me. $3,000's nice. That's nice. I like $3,000, by the way. But here's the problem: is that I'm like, yeah, you don't understand. I'm good. I'm not interested in being on your indictment. And they're like, and then they come back and they're like, nah, bro, you don't understand. Like I'll never say nothing. I'm like, no, you don't understand. Let me tell you what's going to happen. You're going to get arrested, and they're gonna, and you're, I said, and let's pretend for a second you're a solid guy, because I just don't know anybody that is, but let's pretend that person exists. You're a solid guy and you don't say anything. I said, you're going to notice on your indictment that I'm listed. And they were like, well, how? I won't say nothing. I said, here's how. They're going to grab your phone. They're going to run all the phone numbers against all the people that are on probation or been charged. My number is going to come up because my number is a part of that database, because I'm currently on supervised release. They're going to look at my charge. They're going to notice that it's similar to your charge. They're going to go and present that to a grand jury, and they're going to say, we've noticed that there were multiple phone calls between Mr. Cox and this guy. Here's his phone number. Here's what he's been charged with. We want to add him into the indictment. We think he's the ringleader or a participant. Guess what? I said, I'm now on your indictment. I said, I'm going to take a plea and go to prison for 5 years or maybe 10. And they're like, why would you do that? If you just go to trial, I'm not going to plead guilty. I said, one, I can't believe that, because they'll offer you a sweetheart deal to get me. And I said, the second thing is, all the jury's going to hear is they're going to hear from your victims. They're going to hear from people. I said, because hearsay is inadmissible in federal court. So some guy can say, Jimmy told me that Matt did it, or Matt Cox was involved. I said, I can't get on the stand, because the moment I get on the stand, they're going to bring up all of my past history. Mr. Cox, have you been arrested for wire fraud in 2001? Yes. What happened there? Mr. Cox, were you arrested here? Mr. Cox, when the feds came to get you to go on the run? Yes. Mr. Cox, did you continue to commit fraud? Yes. Mr. Cox, what frauds have you been convicted of? I said, boom, 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 boom. Oh, wow, Mr. Cox, those are almost identical to what your co-defendant was convicted of. I said, do you understand that if I was on the jury, I'd convict me? I would say he's involved. And how many phone calls? There was 23 phone calls. 23 phone calls isn't a lot of phone calls over the course of 3 months, by the way. But when you say 23 phone calls, that sounds like that's a conspiracy to me. I said, I can't do that. Now, I can sit there and let them present their case. But when they're done presenting their case and they get a couple witnesses on the stand that say that this guy talked about me, and even if you don't talk about me, I said, they're going to find me guilty then too. I said, so I really have to just go in and say, what kind of a deal can I get? Can I plead guilty to 5 years? I said, because you don't understand the position I'm in. If the cops came to my house right now and said, hey, you know what? We want to search your entire house for drugs. I'd be like, of course. Now, I've never seen drugs before, but by all means, come in, because I don't have the same rights as you. I can't say no. I'm on federal probation. If my probation officer says, yeah, you can search his house, damn, of course you can. I'm surprised that you had to ask, officer. Come on in. I don't know why I didn't suggest it when I opened the door. That's what I got to say. And people don't realize that.
And I think it's similar, like not in any way that way. I think there's a point in time for me, but this friend, I had to recognize that could happen on some level.
Yeah, your best bet in any scenario where someone comes to you and suggests somewhere. Listen, everybody, by the way, every single person that suggests talking to me or even asks me a question about when you went to the DMV and got them to give you the ID, how did you provide this? I immediately come back. I always respond, I am not interested in answering any questions that are related to fraud. Please don't contact me again. And I send it.
You want that on the record. You want that on the record. You want that. You want a record of that.
Every single time. Every single time. Because, anybody that comes to you, it's like, did you ever read In Cold Blood?
Capote.
what is it?
Capote.
Yeah, Capote. You remember what? There's one thing where he says, I forget the main guy, one of the murderers, where he says it's as if we were raised in the same house, and he walked out the back door, and I walked out the front. You know what I'm saying? Like it is that people don't think that, but it are those decisions where most of these criminals are too weak to say, I'm not going to get in the car.
Yeah.
You know, you're lucky they didn't even ask you.
Yeah.
So you didn't have to make that choice. Whatever that ended up being that night, you know, but it takes a strong person to say no. Nah, you're going to go do what? Or that guy's kind of I probably shouldn't be around that guy. You know, he may be a great guy.
Especially as a young person too, you know, because so much of the, not just peer pressure, but the idea of fitting in and the relationships, they feel so consequential, and to like put one of those at risk to lose the, you know, those are all true. I actually feel like in some way, I wonder with my friend, I've often wondered this, if he had just gotten a longer sentence, would it have helped him? Was it the actual problem that he kept getting 2 and 3 year sentences and kept coming back home not fully finished? Like he was almost coming back. He had done some amount of work, enough to get himself back out of the street, but not enough for it to stick. There was no stickiness to it. I don't know. Just whatever.
Well, you know what the problem with that is that I think when the first time I got in trouble, I got 3 years probation. You know, and sometimes I go back and forth. Sometimes I think if I'd gotten a couple of years, you know, maybe I would have learned my lesson, but I don't think so. I don't think that my mind was right. And what I think I don't think giving people 20 and 30 year sentences for certain crimes is legitimate. Like that's just stupidity. What I think is that they have these cutesy programs, you know, Votech, you know, like you can learn to lay drywall or be an electrician, and those are good. I'm not saying they're bad, but I think that there are programs. There's a program in the federal system called RDAP. It's the Residential Drug Treatment Center, or drug treatment program. The problem with that program is it's not a problem. It's that people think it's about drugs. It's not about drugs. You know, they have to tell Congress something to get the money. So we're working on drug addicts. I tell you, bro, right now we almost never talked about drugs. I don't have a drug problem. I just thought I did so I could get in the program.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, like I actually did like a little class with a bunch of drug addicts, just to try and figure out what I needed to know, and I didn't need to know any of it. The truth is, it's about criminal thinking. And I've always said, I don't think anybody should be released from federal prison until they've passed that course, because it teaches you how a normal person thinks as a result of how a criminal thinks. And you can create criminals, you know. I think that a lot of these guys are born, you know, they're sociopaths, but you can re-educate them and teach them to think in a way that makes them think about the consequences before they do things. And you realize when you're in that program how many of these guys, like I thought it was rudimentary and silly.
Yeah.
But let me tell you, 95% of the guys are struggling with just rational thinking. They immediately go off of this. They immediately jump into this conclusion. And you're like, why would you even think that?
Yeah.
Like, obviously, if you do this, this is going to happen, and this and this and this. They don't do that. So, but it's a 9-month program, and I'm telling you, and it does reduce recidivism. I think recidivism in federal system is like 75%. And if you take RDAP, it drops down to like 45%.
Right.
So is that a lot? You know, it's not, it may not be a lot. It's half, and half, if half those guys don't have to come back, that's $30,000 a year, plus the loss of the tax base, which is another 50 something. The actual loss of an individual based on the tax base and what it costs to incarcerate them is around $55,000. So you think, oh, well, the RDAP program costs a lot of money. Well, it doesn't cost $55,000 a year, you know? So like my wife went to RDAP too, and she was a drug addict going into prison, and she'll tell you right now that program saved her life.
Wow.
She's like, I would have never. Like, that's a program probably would cost you $20 grand on the street to go shoot. More than that. It's a 9-month program. That probably costs you 30 or 40 grand. And you have to live there, maybe even more. She's like, I could have never afforded something like this on the street. Like, she's a completely different person. Nobody that knows her before is like, thinks she's the same person at all. This chick is, like when she tells me about her life before, I'm like, what were you thinking? She's like, I was on drugs. It seemed like the reasonable thing to do. I wasn't thinking at all. I was thinking, how do I get through today? That's what I was thinking,
How do I get through today?
Yeah. But I mean, think about it. You don't have to just give somebody 40 years. You could probably give them 10 years and make them pass that program and save yourself the time. And that guy's got a better shot of life, and he wants to, even if you fake it, you pick up something.
Something's going to stick. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Well, the good news is this friend of mine, as I was talking about, a parent, I still connect with his mother. He seems to have gotten some anchoring for himself. He's out in the world. I don't talk to him anymore. Maybe we'll reconnect at some point in the future. Maybe this project will bring him back into my. We'll reconnect in some way, shape, or form as a result of that.
Well, maybe he got older and matured.
Yeah, and that's what happens too.
Yeah,
that's what happens too. We just get older and
not
mature.
Not because of anything he did.
It's just you age out of shit. You just age out of some shit.
I see that.
You just age out of some shit. I got to get ready to boogie here, man.
Yes, sir.
It's been really a pleasure to hang out with you.
Yeah, I'm sorry I dominated the last 20 minutes or 30 minutes, but
okay. This is a learning for me too. These are conversations. That's the point of it, right? To actually not just, I don't know. I feel like these kind of junkets, when you're going around talking about your stuff, I've done them a couple different times. I think it's more fun for you to do it when I'm doing it myself, just to like take the pressure off thinking that the objective is here to sell this product. It's just to actually be people, this, people are drawn to people, and people are drawn to stories. They don't give a shit about like whether your thing that you're trying to peddle is any good. If they don't like you, or if they're not interested in you. So I'm way more interested in just being in conversation with folks, and you are, and it was great to be in conversation with you, man. Thank you for sharing parts of your story with me.
No problem. I appreciate it. What is the name of the podcast?
Sure.
And where can it be
found? The Burden. It's called The Burden. It can be found everywhere. It's currently featured by iHeart, so it's an iHeart Radio podcast. So you can find it on all the different platforms. But it's being distributed by iHeart at this point in time. And we just need people to go and take it out, take a listen. I think once you listen to the trailer in the first episode, it speaks for itself. I probably have not even done good enough justice to the product, even in this endeavor, because there's a lot of people that were involved, and there's a lot of great storytellers. It's fun. It's funny. It's as funny as you can make a situation as the one that I described. It's funny. It's got good moments of levity. It's investigatory. It's revelatory. It's a tour. It's a journey. And it was hard to make it, but it's a really blessing to get it out in the world. And I hope people are finding some enjoyment out of it. They're getting something out of it. And I hope people seek it out, listen to it, give it a shot. That's all I ask.
Hey, you guys, I really appreciate you guys watching. Do me a favor, hit the subscribe button, hit the bell so you get notified of videos just like this. Also, please go to the description box. I'm going to put the link to Dax's podcast, The Burden. Please check it out. Also, please check out my Patreon and my Clips channel. We just started, and it's struggling. So please check it out. I really appreciate it. Link is in the description. Thank you guys so much. See ya.